Snow whispered across the valley that night, moving in slow, ghostly sheets as if the sky were brushing the world with its cold fingertips. Cole Braddock, age 30, rode through it with his hat pulled low, breath rising like smoke from a tired spirit. The winter had been long, cruel enough to strip the land to bone, and even his horse seemed to move with the heaviness of a soul remembering its burdens. Cole wasn't headed anywhere but home, though home felt more like a shelter from the wind than a place for a man to lay his heart. Memories had carved too many quiet wounds inside him, and he preferred not to touch them, the way a man avoids pressing a bruise he knows will ache. Yet as he rode through the silent snowfall, something in the cold stirred a strange alertness inside him, as though the night were hiding a secret just beyond his sight. The river was half frozen, its dark ribbon twisting through the snow like a slow-moving shadow. That was when he spotted the shape, small, crumpled near the icy edge, hair spread like black ink on white canvas. At first he thought it was a trick of the storm, but then the shape trembled. Cole dismounted in one breath, boots sinking into the frost. As he turned the figure over, the world seemed to lurch. A young native woman, Iana, aged 20, though he did not yet know her name, lay shivering violently, lips blue, eyes fluttering as if caught between this world and the next. Snow clung to her eyelashes like fragile frost lace. When he lifted her, she weighed almost nothing, as if winter had already tried to steal too much from her. Cole whispered a curse of fear, gripping her tighter. The wind rose sharply around them, howling as if urging him to move, and somewhere inside that sound, he felt the first spark of something he couldn't yet name, and as he carried her toward his cabin, that spark only grew warmer. He pushed through his cabin door with her in his arms, the storm slamming shut behind him. The small room glowed with the faint light of a dying fire, and he hurried to feed the flames, coaxing them back to life while keeping her close. He removed her soaked boots carefully, hands shaking not from cold but from the fragile fear of doing something wrong. Her dress was damp from the river, her skin frighteningly cold. He wrapped her in every blanket he had, rubbing her arms gently as if urging warmth back into her body. She stirred, murmuring something in her language, soft, broken syllables that sounded like the wind trying to speak. Cole didn't understand the words, yet the tone carried more truth than any sentence he'd ever heard. He whispered reassurances she couldn't possibly comprehend, his voice low and earnest, because silence suddenly felt cruel in her condition. Outside, the storm raged against the windows, but inside, the fire began to glow stronger, casting a honeyed shimmer across her face. As he watched her breathe, slow, fragile, but steadying, an uneasy curiosity tugged at him, wondering who she was and what nightmare had driven her into the snow, though he sensed that answering that question would change more than he was ready for. Throughout the night, Cole tended to her in quiet intervals. When she moaned, he was there. When her fingers twitched toward the blankets, he tucked them around her more firmly. Once, her eyes opened just long enough to meet his. They were dark, reflective, and full of something raw and searching, like she was trying to recognize the world before it slipped away again. Cole felt that gaze like a gentle hand against his chest, warm in a place he thought frozen long ago. He brewed tea and held the tin cup to her lips, helping her sip. When her fingers brushed his by accident, he felt the warmth of her skin like a spark along his veins. She whispered a shaky thank you in English barely steady enough to stand. Cole simply nodded, afraid any words he spoke would betray how deeply this strange responsibility had settled inside him. The fire crackled gently, as though it too sensed a story beginning to take shape, and Cole sat beside her, unsure why his heartbeat wouldn't calm even as her breathing did, but something inside him whispered that dawn would bring trouble he couldn't yet see. By morning, whispers of what he'd done had reached Bitter Ridge. The town had long memories of fear and short tempers for anything unfamiliar, and a native woman being sheltered by a white cowboy stirred up old prejudices like dust in the wind. Sheriff Dawson Kettering arrived at Cole's cabin that afternoon, snow still clinging to his coat. A small posse followed him, faces tight with suspicion. Cole opened the door halfway, blocking their view with his broad frame. The sheriff didn't shout. He didn't need to. "Cole," he said quietly, "you know she can't stay here. There'll be trouble if you keep her under your roof." The words carried the weight of the town's judgment, cold and sharp as ice. Cole's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He wasn't a man for speeches, but his silence had always carried a stubborn strength. Behind him, Ayanna sat up slightly against the wall, hearing enough to understand she was the unwanted piece in this uneasy picture. The shame that crossed her face stabbed deeper than Cole expected, like a cold hand gripping his heart. He shut the door on the sheriff's lingering warning, his pulse sharp with unspoken anger, and when he turned back to her, he saw fear shaping her features, a fear that made him wonder if he was already losing something he hadn't realized he wanted. Days passed with the storm hemming them into the cabin, and slowly, a fragile gentleness began to grow between them. Ayanna moved quietly, helping where she could despite her exhaustion, sweeping the floors, boiling water, placing small bundles of dried sage near the hearth. Cole showed her how to grind coffee beans with the old handmill, and she laughed softly when the grinder stuck, the sound surprising both of them with its warmth. In the evenings they sat by the fire, sometimes speaking, sometimes simply listening to the wind. One night, her long hair fell over her shoulder as she leaned forward, and Cole reached out without thinking, tucking a loose strand behind her ear. His fingers brushed her cheek, warm and smooth, and she looked at him with a quiet intensity that made time slow. The firelight painted her face in gold and amber, and he felt something shift inside him with the softness of snow landing on a branch. Ayanna told him, in halting English, that she had no family left in her tribe, lost to illness, displacement, and the cruel tangle of conflicts she did not elaborate on. Cole didn't press her. Pain recognized pain, even without words. Her voice trembled, and he felt an ache to protect her growing inside him like a stubborn flame, yet a worry lingered at the edges of their peace, the sense that the town's judgment was waiting patiently, sharpening itself like a knife. The worry proved justified. One morning, when Cole was out mending fences, 3 townsfolk arrived at the cabin. They didn't shout. Cruelty seldom needs volume. Their words were shaped in cold, polite tones. If Ayanna stayed, Cole would pay the price. Trade cut off, cattle unbought, land disputed. They spoke as though she were the root of every future hardship he might face, as if her existence were a misstep that needed correcting. Ayanna listened without defending herself. She folded her hands tightly in her lap, letting their venom settle over her without reaction. When they left, she moved quietly, packing what little she had been given. A blanket, a few pieces of bread, a wooden charm she'd carved in secret. She set the charm on Cole's table, a small woven figure meant for protection, and she left the cabin with tears freezing on her cheeks, believing that leaving was the only kindness she had the right to offer him. As the snow swallowed her footsteps, the cabin seemed to grow colder, already missing the gentle presence she'd brought. When Cole returned at dusk and found the empty space where she'd slept, the untouched chair by the fire, and the charm lying alone on the table, a sound escaped him, quiet but tore from somewhere deep. He rushed outside before the fear inside him could form into words, and the night swallowed him as he rode into it. Cold cut into him as he searched the land for her, calling her name into the relentless wind. Snow stung his eyes, but he pushed on, driven by a panic he didn't recognize. Her absence hollowed him in ways he hadn't expected. He remembered the moments they'd shared, her laughter when coffee grounds spilled, her soft voice telling him she felt safe for the first time in years, the gentle weight of her head resting briefly against his shoulder when she'd fallen asleep by the fire. Each memory fueled his desperation. Hours passed, shadows lengthening, and the storm thickened until he could barely see past his horse's mane. But then, at the cedar grove, he saw her, crumpled again in the snow, arms wrapped weakly around herself, breath faint. Cole dropped to his knees beside her, pulling her into his arms with a trembling urgency. "Ayanna," he whispered, voice cracking, "I'm here. I'm not letting you go again." Her eyes fluttered open, hazy and disbelieving, as if she thought he were a dream. He held her tighter, shielding her from the wind, and something wordless passed between them, raw, fragile, and undeniable. He lifted her carefully and carried her through the storm, each step a vow he didn't yet know how to speak, and the wind softened around them as though the world recognized the choice he had made. Back in the cabin, he warmed her gently, speaking to her in soft tones until her shivers steadied. When she was strong enough to sit by the fire, he knelt in front of her, hat in hand, heart exposed in a way he had never allowed before. "Stay," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "Not because you owe me anything, but because I want you here. With me." Ayana stared at him, searching his face for doubt, but found none. Tears filled her eyes, quiet, grateful tears, and she nodded once, the smallest of gestures but heavier than any spoken vow. Within a week, after she recovered fully, Cole asked Sheriff Dawson to oversee a simple wedding. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, torn between duty and conscience, but something in Cole's determined gaze softened him. Ayana wore a white deerskin dress she'd sewn herself, decorated with small turquoise beads that trembled like captured sky. Cole dressed in his best shirt, brushing the snowflakes from his hat with nervous hands. They exchanged vows in the snowy meadow behind the cabin, surrounded by quiet pines and hesitant witnesses. When Cole lifted her hand and kissed it, Ayana felt warmth bloom through her like spring running beneath frozen ground. Their union wasn't grand, but it held a depth neither had ever known, and as they walked back toward the cabin hand in hand, the world felt subtly altered, as though they had carved out a space that belonged only to them. Married life settled around them with a softness neither expected. In the mornings, Cole would trace his fingers gently through Ayana's hair before she woke, marveling at its silky fall across the pillow. They shared coffee by the fire, sitting close enough that their shoulders brushed naturally, comfortably. Sometimes he would turn on an old violin tune from a worn-down music box, and they would dance slowly across the wooden floor, his hand warm against the small of her back. Their laughter filled the cabin in delicate bursts, like sparks rising from a hearth. Ayana taught Cole her tribe's stories, told in soft rhythms that soothed something inside him he hadn't realized was bruised. And in return, he showed her the quiet beauty of the land he'd spent his life working, sunrises over frost-kissed fields, the calm breath of horses in winter light. Little by little, the townspeople began to see the truth of their bond. What started as suspicion grew into reluctant acceptance, then into small, hesitant kindnesses. A sack of flour left at their door, a blanket woven by one of the townswomen, a nod from a man who once stared too long. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't immediate, but it was real, and it warmed Ayana in ways the fire never could. Years later, the two of them stood by the same river where he'd first found her. Snow dusted the trees, and the water moved peacefully beneath a sky softened by winter light. Cole held her hand, thumb brushing her knuckles with the gentleness of a man who had learned love one small moment at a time. Ayana leaned against him, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "Your kindness saved more than my life. It saved my hope." Cole didn't answer with words. He turned and kissed her forehead, letting silence carry the depth of his heart. Their steps along the riverbank were slow and unhurried, like two souls who finally understood the language of belonging. Snowflakes drifted around them, landing softly on their shoulders, as though blessing each choice that had led them here. And in the quiet, Cole felt a truth blooming inside him, that some winters come to break a man open, but others come to teach him how to heal. If you were standing there with them, listening to the hush of the snow, you might understand the lesson too, that one act of grace can change the course of a life, that love often begins in the smallest of gestures, that warmth can be found even in the harshest seasons if you dare to reach for it. The river continued its gentle whispering, carrying their story onward, and somewhere in the drifting frost, a thought lingered, soft, hopeful, and waiting, reminding anyone who listened that every winter, no matter how cold, hides a new beginning just beneath the snow and perhaps, just beyond it, another chapter ready to unfold.